If we draw, our lines are the words we use. They contain so much of the meaning of our artwork, so much of the impact of our artwork. No wonder we want them to be expressive. We want them to have life, to have vitality, to have interest, to have feeling. And not just any one line, but all of our lines together. But what if I'm frustrated that my line work is stiff, it's wooden, it's dead? At best, it may capture the shape of the objects, but nothing of the feelings of the objects, nothing of the feelings of the scene. Well, if that's the case, then this is the right video for you. Because I'm wanting to suggest now some of the ways of thinking and some of the ways of drawing, some of the techniques we may use, which can easily contribute to drawings where the line work lacks expression. And I think these are quite common, and particularly with self-taught artists, where one of the drawbacks of working out our own way of drawing development is sometimes we don't have someone who's able to troubleshoot our drawings, someone who's able to say, have you thought of drawing it this way? Have you thought of doing this with your line work? And so we can start to get entrenched over and over in drawing after drawing with a certain way of thinking and therefore drawing, a way which is not helpful for producing the line work that we see in other people's drawings and we would perhaps like to have in our own. And I'm starting by talking about some of the issues, some of the ways of thinking that produce fairly stiff, expressionless line work, because I'm wanting to convince anyone using these methods or having this way of thinking to change. And change is difficult. There are reasons why we do what we do the way we do it. But there's a very helpful truism in life that if nothing changes, nothing changes. And that includes the way we think when we draw and the various techniques that we use when we draw. And we can want our line work to be more expressive all that we want. But if we're not prepared to actually go through the effort and maybe the pain of changing what we do, it's simply not going to happen. Changes will be vital if we're going to introduce more expressive line work into our drawings. So I want to focus on some of the unhelpful ways of thinking and drawing that we may have fallen into to give ourselves time to think, yes, I do that, or I do something similar. So we have time to build up a little resolve to make changes so that when I outline techniques or exercises we could do to introduce more expressiveness in our line work, we're more prepared to think, oh look, I'm willing to give it a go. I talk about how we think because how we draw actually comes from how we think. It's a great mistake to focus on technique and not to think about how our thought processes determine what techniques we use. This is why I talk so much in my videos about my thought processes, because how I draw comes from how I think. My thought processes are the key to understanding the choices I make and the techniques I adopt when I draw. So what are our thought processes even before we start to draw? And when we first look at our reference and when we first pick up a pen, what's going on in our head that's directing how we put lines on the paper? Because expressive lines is really about how we put the lines on the paper, as much, if not more, as what lines we put on the paper where. The first thinking process that I think contributes to lifeless line work is thinking too much about producing a finished artwork at the end. I've talked about this in a couple of videos now, but it's very easy, particularly for beginners and for self-taught artists, to feel this pressure or this desire to have a nice artwork at the end, rather than see our drawing session as a process, as a learning process that may or may not produce an artwork at the end. And certainly at the start, if we're earlier in our drawing experience than later, there should be not just more of an expectation, but actually a deliberate choice to use our drawing session as a time to learn, to experiment, to take risks, to refine our skills, not to start by finishing up with the end product of an artwork. Because that I'm producing an artwork pressure will inhibit what we draw and how we draw it. It will make us nervous and apprehensive with our lines in case we make a mistake. It makes us overly cautious. Expressive line work comes from a freedom when we're drawing the line. Now that freedom comes from a number of places. One of them is practice, but not having to have a perfect result is another place that freedom comes from, which I lose if every line has to be perfect to contribute towards the perfect artwork at the end. So is this you? Do you start your drawing afraid that every line's going to spoil the drawing? Because this will produce lines that have been drawn overly cautiously and which will all look the same. The other thing that this over preoccupation with everything looking right at the end is it creates this focus on outline, on the overall shape of the objects in the scene. A constant focus on the part that I'm drawing and making sure I get the basic lines of the outline right. Now, I'm all for good proportions, don't get me wrong. But when this becomes too much of a focus, it's an unhelpful thing. Now, it's easily done, particularly at the start of our drawing, because nothing makes a drawing look less right than inaccurate proportions or angles or lines. But there's a lot more to a drawing than an accurate outline. And I see lots of drawings where the outlines of the objects are accurate enough, but in the end it looks like they've been traced over about 3 times. And they have this heavy wooden effect. Again, it flattens the scene and creates a lifeless effect. And this thinking can lead us to draw each object in a way in isolation, certainly in our thinking, when in effect every line is part of a whole, and it's the overall combination of all the lines which often breathes life into the drawing, into the scene, which often gives expression to any one line. And when we focus on each object and accuracy of the shape, we're probably not thinking about how this object's position within the scene in relation to the other objects might impact the way we draw the lines, not just exactly where we draw them. And if we're in a course or a class, this is one of the things that a good teacher will do, would direct students from being overly focused on what they're drawing and to put more focus on how we're drawing it. Because it's not the aspect of drawing that is most immediately coming to mind when we start to draw. But if we're self-taught, we need to do this ourselves. We need to not just look at the shapes we're drawing, but at how we're drawing them. But again, because we want an artwork at the end, we often have an over-reliance on our reference. Now, there's almost nothing more important than careful observation of our reference. So I'm not talking about not observing what's in our reference. The problem is when we take what we've seen and try to copy it with lines in an unhelpful way. Because for most subjects we draw, our reference actually will contain far more, if you like, lines than we could possibly draw. So we try and draw lines to copy what cannot be copied. Millions of leaves, thousands of bricks, hundreds of people. And because we're focused on outline of objects, we're obviously very quickly overwhelmed. And what I often see artists doing in these situations is developing a pattern to represent that subject. So a pattern to represent leaf work, a pattern to represent brickwork, to represent what's there that's too overwhelming to actually try and draw accurately. The problem is these patterns end up looking like wallpaper. It's like there's been this foliage pattern drawn and the artist has then cut it out in the silhouette of the tree canopy and stuck it on their paper. And so it ends up being very flat. It ends up fighting against any three-dimensional shape that the outline would be suggesting. One of the benefits of expressive lines is that they do suggest three-dimensionality in our drawing, creating patterns that we use as a sort of shorthand for things that are too complicated to draw, always has a flattening two-dimensional look, which does then put a lifeless wooden feel over our drawing. While we're talking two-dimensional drawing, the other problem when in our thinking we're so focused on the outline and getting things looking accurate that we don't consider where they are in our scene is that we don't draw for where they are. We don't modify our line work depending whether an item is close to the front or in the further distance. We use the same lines over all the elements of our scene, wherever they might be in the plane. Our drawings will look particularly flat and lifeless if we don't work to create a sense of depth in our line work. Are any of these issues your issues in your drawings? It can be helpful if generally we're not happy with the way our line work looks, to grab a good representation of our drawings and to put them all in front of us and to look at them and try and work out in more specific ways what's not working, what's particularly not working. Compare them to drawings of artists whose line work we find really engaging, really lively, really expressive, and to say what's happening in their drawings that's not happening in my drawings regarding the line work. Because one of the things we need to get is a new focus in our thinking, a sense of what sort of lines am I trying to draw. But being very aware of what line works I don't want to draw is a really important part of this, because it's my opinion really that counts as the artist. And if I can go back to the earlier stage of my thinking, if I can work out what are my thinking processes, what are my thoughts even before I start to draw, are they helpful ones? So do I feel the pressure of trying to produce a perfect artwork? Because that's also something to try and overcome if I want to be able to develop lines that are more expressive. So we critique our work, but we are never critical of ourselves. We critique our work because that gives us a focus of where we can improve. It gives us direction of where to look and how we want to practice, where we want to develop our thinking, our processes. So we're not just endlessly repeating the thoughts and processes that produce drawings that we're not happy with. And if you're finding this helpful, or you've found some of my other videos helpful and you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. And if you have ideas on videos that you'd like to see me make, then please just add them as a comment to this one, because it can be hard to know what sort of videos I should focus on making in the future. But what can we do? How can we change the way we think and therefore the way we draw lines so that we can start to shift our line work from looking stiff and wooden to looking wonderfully gestural and expressive? How do I change these things? And can I warn that change, when we go to do it, may feel surprisingly scary, because some of my unhelpful drawing techniques may have come from a place of being afraid to make a mistake. And if I start to risk more mistakes, then that's going to threaten the part of me that doesn't want to make them. Some of these things I'm about to talk about are ways of, if you like, pushing myself out of the nest when it comes to my line work, making it easy to step outside of an unhelpful way of thinking, to give me a chance to have a new experience of line work, of drawing, and practice of new ways, and hopefully to build confidence in better ways of drawing lines than I'm able to draw when I'm overly preoccupied with making mistakes. And you may be surprised that in a video on expressive line work, I'm not actually doing any drawing. That's been quite deliberate, because one of the things we need to stop doing is copying the drawings of other artists. Now, by all means, be inspired by their line work. Study their line work. Work out how do they create the effect with their line work of life in the drawing, of depth in the drawing. Whatever it is we admire in the drawing, how does their line work contribute it? But then not falling into the trap of trying to copy their line work in a line by line drawing, because then I go back to this unhelpful focus on getting every line in the right place, and I never change my thinking. I actually reinforce my unhelpful preoccupation with accuracy thinking. What I need to do is I need to learn to draw those lines myself. So these are some exercises to help make that happen. I'll start with the scariest, drawing ink. So if you draw in pencil normally, stop drawing in pencil and start drawing with ink. Because if I'm overly preoccupied with my lines and making sure they're correct, then I'm probably erasing every line I draw 2 or 3 times. I am never going to get expressive lines when I'm drawing every line 5 times, erasing it, redrawing it, erasing it, redrawing it. And if I don't draw in pencil, I shortcut that whole draw, erase treadmill. And if I do normally draw in pen, but I have a pencil under drawing that I use, then I need to stop doing that for the same reason. That has the added problem, in fact, of tempting me to trace over the pencil outline exactly. And tracing, whether it's tracing over a reference or tracing over my pencil outline, will always introduce a lifeless quality, because my focus is on the tracing. It's not on representing the object in my line work expressively. Tracing and copying give no practice to the thought processes, the creativity that I need to develop to be able to draw my own original expressive line work. So I don't want to develop ways of drawing that will never take me to the place I want to get. So it can be helpful for me to change the scale with which I draw. If I tend to draw small, then I need to draw larger. If I tend to draw larger, I need to draw smaller. I would think for what I'm talking about, something between A4 and half A4, this size or this size, are good sizes for a sheet of paper to practice and develop loose, brisk, confident lines. But whatever size you normally draw, can I suggest you draw larger or smaller depending what you're doing at the moment? Because remember, we're wanting to shake up the way we think. And the more things we change at once, the easier it will be to do that in a bigger way. If I'm not drawing at all the way I have been drawing, then I can't cling to those ways of thinking and of actually putting the lines on paper. I have a couple of videos on how to draw straight lines. They may be helpful to look at if you haven't looked at any already, because drawing a straight line is a skill that we can practice as a separate exercise to actually producing a drawing. In fact, it can give us the confidence that I can draw a nice, brisk, freehand straight line when I am doing a drawing. Another helpful way to shake up how I draw is to give myself a time limit and to stick to it really rigidly. If I only give myself 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 or 60 minutes to complete a drawing from start to finish, then it forces me to focus on more things in a shorter period of time. It doesn't let me get overly preoccupied with just some elements of line work, the ones that I've always focused on. I have to start doing brisk, faster lines and take the risk that they may not be in the right place, but that the drawing may still look okay anyway. But as I said, this only works if we force ourselves to basically finish the whole scene in some way in that time limit. If I give myself a 10-minute time limit, but I only ever draw a quarter or a half of the reference, then it's not working for me, because I'm probably still drawing my old unhelpful ways, but only producing half the drawing. I haven't pushed myself to change how I draw. And that's the key thing. I need to change how I draw if I want to develop different looking line work. Because I can't introduce liveliness, looseness, briskness into my line work if I'm overly preoccupied with the line not being perfectly right. I'm never talking about drawing careless lines. So there is a balance between maintaining control through practice and experience at drawing briskly and going and just hoping it's somewhere in the right place. We don't want the lines because then our drawing will just look sloppy. So there are skills to be developed here, but we don't develop them unless we can change our mindset from being afraid of mistakes or of being preoccupied with outline or whatever the unhelpful way of thinking we've adopted, we've developed without realizing. I've done a few very short time drawings lately for some of my YouTube videos, and I found it an incredibly helpful and stimulating thing to do. It really has, I think, helped me bring back a bit of a liveliness into my line work. Another, I think, very helpful variation on this timed drawing is to draw the same reference in 5 minutes, and then in 10 minutes, and then in 15 minutes, and then in 20 or 30 minutes, one after the other, because that helps us to see the earlier, quicker ones really as being an exercise, and therefore not to be worried too much about how they look, but to be, if you like, warming up our line work, warming up our confidence in drawing lines, so that by the time we get to whatever the longest one is, our mind, our hand, our thinking, our drawing has had practice at sitting in this riskier but more expressive place in drawing lines. It really is easier after the first one to build on that in the second and third one in much less time than it took in the first one. Sometimes we know more clearly what we want to do, and sometimes we know more clearly what we want to make sure we don't do. This next point, this next way of developing a different way of thinking and drawing is incredibly important, and it's a huge thing, and I'm only going to just touch on it and outline it here, is that instead of thinking all the time about how do I represent shapes accurately, as important as that is for the overall effect of our drawing, I also need to spend just as much time thinking, what is the effect of what I'm looking at in my reference? And how can I capture that effect in my line work? And this is what's lost when we use patterns to represent certain textures, because we've stopped looking at what's actually in front of us and we've started to think about just creating a shorthand version of drawing what can't be drawn. Instead of saying, what's the effect of what we're looking at and how can I capture that effect? And I think this is most easily seen in trees. And if you haven't watched any of my how to draw tree videos, then please watch at least one of them, because I think it's the clearest example of how we can focus on drawing the effect of what's in our reference rather than trying to draw the exactness. And particularly when the outlines are impossibly complicated and too detailed to draw, how can I capture the effect? I think the other important effect that we want to look at creating in our drawings that's particularly contributing to expressive looking line work, if we get it right, is creating the effect of distance. How do I make something feel closer or further away, not just because of how large it is or what the perspective angles are, but that some things just look closer, that I can see them more easily, and other things look further away, look as though they're less distinct, because it's my line work, which is one of the most important tools I have to create this effect. Now, if I'm using tone or color, then I've got those as well. But it starts with the line work. Again, I've got a number of videos on creating a sense of depth. And if you watch any of those, you'll see in detail explained and demonstrated the way by changing the way our line work looks and what we draw with it, we create a sense of depth. And a sense of depth is an important expressiveness of our scene. Flat wooden lines produce a two-dimensional effect. See, our line work is a tool for expressing effects. It's not just a means of outlining shapes, which reinforces the fact that how we draw the line, not just where we draw the line, is important. And it's often the key thing that's missing in drawing that looks lifeless. All the lines are drawn the same. And learning to draw lines of various thicknesses, learning to think through what purpose, what effect is this line of this object having, and varying my line work is an important part of that. Look at the work of artists whose drawings you think have particularly expressive line work, and I guarantee that in almost every instance you'll see a change in the thickness of lines somewhere in their drawing. It may be they've actually changed the pen they use. It may be that they've drawn some lines slower to get more of a flow of ink on the paper. It may be they've drawn some lines very quickly to get less ink, and they've held the pen more lightly against the paper to get an even lighter, thinner line. But changing our drawing techniques so that we draw lines that look different to the lines we're drawing at the moment will be vital if we want to change the way our line work looks. I can't say strongly enough, if I'm not happy with the effect of my line work in my drawings, then I need to change how I do it. But if we become less preoccupied with producing an artwork at the end, less concerned about a line being wrong, learn to embrace mistakes and incorporate them into the overall finished drawing. And let me say, there are ways we can make mistakes look less obvious in lots of instances as well. So there are ways we can help ourselves push through that afraid of making mistakes. Can I suggest sitting down and doing some of these exercises, even if you think, I can't really see how that's going to change anything, and just see if it doesn't help, not just help you draw more expressive lines, but actually make drawing more enjoyable. The best drawings are done when we feel relaxed and comfortable with what we're doing. And if you've ever made it to the end of any of my videos, you know I always end them with, well, whatever you're drawing, however you're drawing it, have fun. G'day, I'm Travers. And more than in any videos before, I say that now. If you have any questions about this, please ask me in the comments, because I think this is a really crucial subject. But whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, have fun. I will see you next time. Bye.